November 22nd, 1963, 12:30 p.m., Dallas, Texas. The most powerful man in the world was killed in broad daylight, in front of hundreds of witnesses on camera. The official investigation concluded that a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, acted alone. He was arrested within hours, and 48 hours later, before he could stand trial, he was shot dead on live television inside a police station by Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner with known connections to organized crime figures. Three powerful mob bosses had strong reasons to hate the Kennedy administration. Carlos Marcello of New Orleans had been aggressively targeted for deportation by Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Santo Traficante of Tampa had worked with the CIA on plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. Sam Giancana of Chicago had reportedly helped deliver crucial Union votes that aided John Kennedy's narrow victory in the year 1960 election, and felt deeply betrayed when Robert Kennedy launched the most intense federal crackdown on organized crime in American history. Whether any of these men, or the organizations they led, played a role in what happened in Dallas remains one of the most debated questions in modern American history. The Warren Commission concluded there was no credible evidence of a conspiracy. Later investigations, including the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1979, found a probable conspiracy, but could not identify the participants or prove any direct mob involvement. This is the story of the documented tensions between the Kennedy brothers and organized crime, the threats, the surveillance, the deportation attempts, the CIA mob plots against Castro, and the deep sense of betrayal felt by powerful mob figures after 1960. It is also the story of how those tensions have fueled decades of speculation about what really happened on that November day in Dallas. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will never look at American history the same way again. Before we go any further, hit subscribe right now. Hit the like button and share this with someone who thinks they already know everything about American history. Now drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you are watching this from and what time it is. Because this community is global, and I read every single comment. Now get comfortable, because we are going back to 1963. To understand what happened in Dallas, you have to understand the world that made Dallas possible. You have to understand what America looked like in 1963, not the sanitized, nostalgic version, not the black and white photograph of JFK and Jackie smiling in the Rose Garden, but the real America, the complicated, violent, corrupt, deeply compromised America that existed behind the postcard image of Camelot. Start with the fear. In 1963, Americans were genuinely, existentially afraid. The Cold War was not an abstraction. It was a daily reality. Soviet nuclear missiles capable of reaching American cities within minutes were a constant background hum to everyday life. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills in school, crouching under wooden desks as if that would save them from a thermonuclear warhead. Fallout shelters were advertised in popular magazines. The question was not whether a nuclear war would come. For many Americans, the question was when. The Cuban Missile Crisis had occurred just 13 months before Dallas. For 13 days in October 1962, the world had held its breath while Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev traded ultimatums over Soviet missiles in Cuba. It was, by any reasonable measure, the closest the human race had ever come to nuclear annihilation. And while Kennedy had ultimately navigated that crisis with remarkable skill, managing to resolve it without either capitulating or provoking war, the experience had shaken the country deeply. Cuba, that word keeps coming back. Cuba was the open wound of early 1960s American politics. A wound that bled into everything, into the CIA, into the mob, into the Kennedy administration's relationship with Cuban exile communities in Miami and New Orleans, into the specific, personal animosities that would eventually converge in Dallas. But we will get to Cuba in detail. First, understand the political America of 1963. Kennedy was popular, genuinely popular, in a way that modern polling and political science struggle to fully capture. He was young, the youngest man ever elected president. He was charismatic in a way that the new medium of television amplified to an almost mythological scale. He was funny, witty, self-deprecating in a way that seemed entirely authentic. He had a beautiful wife. He had young children. He represented, to millions of Americans, something like hope. But behind that image, behind the carefully managed public persona of new frontier optimism, there were shadows. Kennedy's health was far worse than the public knew. He suffered from Addison's disease, a life-threatening adrenal condition. He had severe, chronic back pain from a wartime injury and multiple surgeries. He was, on many days, managing levels of physical pain that would have incapacitated ordinary people. He was treated by a physician who administered injections of uncertain composition. The full picture of Kennedy's medical situation was carefully concealed from the public. His personal life was equally complicated. Kennedy was, by all credible historical accounts, a compulsive womanizer. He had affairs throughout his marriage and his presidency. Some of these affairs were merely personal scandals in waiting. Others had national security implications of extraordinary seriousness. One woman he slept with was simultaneously sleeping with the boss of the Chicago outfit. Another was a suspected East German intelligence asset. The Secret Service knew. J. Edgar Hoover knew, and Hoover, who built power by accumulating blackmail material on the powerful, kept meticulous files. But Kennedy's personal complications are not the core of this story. The core of this story is power, specifically, the kind of power that had been building in America for 4 decades, quietly, ruthlessly, patiently, in the shadows of legitimate institutions. The kind of power that wore expensive suits and ate at fine restaurants and contributed to political campaigns and controlled vast territories of American economic and political life without ever appearing in a civics textbook. The power of organized crime. To understand the American Mafia in 1963, you have to go back to 1920. January 17, 1920. The Volstead Act takes effect. Prohibition begins. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages becomes illegal throughout the United States. It was one of the most consequential policy failures in American history. Within months, a black market for alcohol, worth hundreds of millions of dollars per year, was operating openly in every major American city. The demand was enormous and entirely unmet by legitimate supply. The profit margins were staggering. And into that vacuum stepped a generation of immigrant entrepreneurs, mostly Italian, mostly from Sicily and southern Italy, some Jewish, some Irish, who had the organizational capacity, the violence, and the complete disregard for legal niceties required to satisfy that demand. They were not yet the Mafia in the way we now think of them. They were competing criminal enterprises. They fought each other, sometimes openly and bloodily, for control of territories and supply lines. The gang wars of the 1920s, the street Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago, the Castellammares War in New York, were brutal consolidation processes. Criminal natural selection, the weak were eliminated. The strong survived. By 1931, the survivors had done something remarkable. They had organized, under the leadership of Lucky Luciano in New York, with the financial genius of Meyer Lansky operating behind the scenes. The major criminal enterprises of America had restructured themselves into a federation, a commission, 26 families, each controlling a specific geographic territory, each operating with internal discipline and external coordination. They called it La Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours. Prohibition ended in 1933, but the mob did not dissolve. They had learned something during Prohibition that proved far more valuable than the alcohol trade itself. They had learned how to corrupt, how to systematically, methodically purchase the cooperation of policemen, politicians, judges, and prosecutors. How to embed themselves in legitimate businesses, construction, waste removal, food service, entertainment, as both a money laundering mechanism and a genuine source of economic power. How to control labor unions and use that control to extract tribute from entire industries. By the time Prohibition ended, the mob was not a criminal organization that happened to have some political influence. It was a political economic power structure that happened to be criminal. The distinction matters in the 1950s. The mob made its most audacious expansion yet. Cuba, under the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. Cuba had become the mob's playground. Meyer Lansky, the financial brain of the entire enterprise. A man whose accounting skills were matched only by his complete immunity to moral scruple, had worked out a partnership with Batista. The mob would invest in and run Havana's luxury hotel casinos. Batista would provide protection, police cooperation, and political cover. The profits would be split. The results were spectacular. The Riviera, the Nacional, the Capri, the Havana Hilton, these were not low-rent gambling dens. These were world-class establishments that attracted celebrities, politicians, and wealthy tourists from across the Americas and Europe. Frank Sinatra performed in Havana. Hollywood stars vacationed there. The money was, by any measure, extraordinary. Santo Trafficante Jr. ran the day-to-day gambling operations. Carlos Marcello had interests. Sam Giancana had interests. Lansky, as always, had his hands in everything, taking his percentage from every cash flow. Then, on January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro's forces entered Havana. Batista fled, and overnight, the mob lost everything. Castro closed the casinos. He nationalized the hotels. He seized mob assets worth, in aggregate, hundreds of millions of dollars. Santo Trafficante was briefly imprisoned in Cuba before being released under circumstances that would later generate their own dark questions. The mob's Caribbean paradise was gone. The fury this generated cannot be overstated. These were not men who accepted losses philosophically. These were men who responded to grievances with violence. And now they had a grievance worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Located 90 miles off the coast of Florida, embodied in the person of one bearded revolutionary. They wanted Castro dead. As it happened, so did the Central Intelligence Agency. Let us talk about the CIA's relationship with organized crime, because it is essential to everything that follows. The CIA had been created in 1947. By the early 1950s, under Director Allen Dulles, it had developed an institutional culture that prioritized results over legality, secrecy over accountability, and the Cold War imperative to confront Soviet influence by whatever means necessary. The ends justified the means. Always, when Castro took Cuba, the CIA was tasked with removing him. Various approaches were considered. Invasion by CIA-trained Cuban exile forces, internal destabilization, and assassination. Assassination posed a problem. The CIA had no reliable internal assassination capability that could operate in Cuba. They needed people who knew how to arrange murders quietly and professionally. People with access to the Cuban exile community. People who had deep personal reasons to want Castro eliminated. They needed the mob. The approach was made through intermediaries. Sheffield Edwards, the CIA's director of security, worked through a private investigator named Robert Maheu, a former FBI agent, to contact Johnny Roselli, a senior member of the Chicago outfit with extensive Las Vegas and Miami connections. Roselli was enthusiastic. he brought in Sam Giancana and Santo Trafficante as partners in the operation. Think about what this means for a moment. The Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America was sitting across a table from the bosses of the Chicago and Tampa organized crime families, discussing the murder of a foreign head of state. They were providing poison pills, weapons, intelligence. The mob was providing the operational network and the willing hands. This was not a rumor. This was documented in CIA internal reviews and confirmed by Senate investigations in the 1970s. It happened. The CIA did recruit mob figures including Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, and Santo Trafficante for plots to assassinate Fidel Castro beginning in 1960. Some plots continued into 1962, early 1963. Though Robert Kennedy was reportedly furious when briefed and ordered them halted, all known attempts failed. Castro, who had his own intelligence apparatus and his own genuine popular support, proved remarkably difficult to kill. But the partnership created something that would outlast any specific operation. It created a network of connections, obligations, and shared secrets between American intelligence and American organized crime. It created men on both sides who knew things about each other that could not be disclosed publicly. Men who had mutual leverage, men who shared a deep, burning frustration with the same target. When that frustration eventually transferred from Castro to Kennedy, those connections were already in place. Now, the mob's infiltration of American cities. You cannot understand the mob's power in 1963 without understanding how thoroughly it had embedded itself in American urban life over the preceding 4 decades. Chicago, Sam Giancana ran an organization, the Chicago Outfit, that controlled gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, and political corruption across the entire metropolitan area and into the suburbs. The outfit had relationships with virtually every significant Chicago politician. They had policemen on their payroll. They had judges who could be relied upon. They had union officials who delivered labor peace in exchange for payoffs and occasional violence against union rivals. The Chicago outfit's annual revenue in the early 1960s was estimated by various law enforcement sources at hundreds of millions of dollars. New Orleans, Carlos Marcello was, by the assessment of virtually every law enforcement agency that studied him, one of the most powerful organized crime figures in the United States. His territory encompassed New Orleans, the Gulf Coast, and critically, Dallas and much of Texas. He operated through layers of legitimate businesses. He had relationships with Louisiana politicians at every level. He was, by multiple accounts, essentially untouchable within his own territory. Federal agents could investigate him, could build cases against him, could haul him before congressional committees. He would survive it all. Tampa and Florida. Santo Trafficante Jr. ran the Florida operation with the quiet efficiency of a successful businessman. His father, Santo Trafficante Sr., had built the Tampa organization. The son expanded it, diversified it, and brought to it a particular operational sophistication that impressed even his peers. Trafficante was not flashy. He was not prone to outbursts. He was patient, careful, and utterly ruthless. People who crossed him tended to disappear or die under circumstances that were difficult to definitively attribute to him. Las Vegas, the mob had built Las Vegas. That is not a metaphor. The major casino hotels on the Strip, the Flamingo, the Sands, the Desert Inn, the Stardust, had been financed with mob money, operated by mob-connected managers, and used as mechanisms to skim tax-free cash from gambling revenues. Meyer Lansky's genius was the skim. Before any official revenue was counted, cash was removed from the counting rooms and transported, untaxed and unrecorded, to mob coffers, Las Vegas. In the early 1960s was an ATM that printed money for organized crime. New York, 5 families, Gambino, Lucchese, Bonanno, Colombo, Genovese divided the nation's largest city among themselves and maintained their division through the discipline of the Commission. New York was, in some ways, the most complex mob territory in the country, because the sheer size of the city meant that the mob's economic interests were correspondingly larger and more varied. And running through all of it, the connective tissue that held the entire national structure together, was Meyer Lansky. Lansky was not technically a mafia boss. He was Jewish. And La Cosa Nostra's formal membership was restricted to men of Italian descent. But Lansky occupied a unique position. He had been Lucky Luciano's financial partner since the 1920s. He had helped design the Commission's financial architecture. He ran money through Caribbean banking systems, through Swiss accounts, through layers of legitimate and semi-legitimate businesses that made tracing the cash almost impossible. He was the mob's banker, its investment advisor, its offshore financial planner. The FBI considered him one of the most dangerous criminals in America. He was investigated repeatedly over 5 decades. He was almost never successfully prosecuted. He died in his bed in Miami in 1983 at the age of 80. Natural causes. This was the America of 1963. This was the power structure that Kennedy had, perhaps without fully understanding what he was doing, chosen to take on. The story of how John Kennedy came to be president is inseparable from the story of how the mob came to feel betrayed by him. Go back to 1960, the Democratic primary. Kennedy is running against a field that includes Lyndon Johnson, the powerful Senate Majority Leader, and Hubert Humphrey, the liberal senator from Minnesota. Kennedy is young, Catholic, wealthy, and personally compelling. But he is not the establishment candidate. He needs to win primaries to demonstrate electability. He needs to demonstrate that a Catholic can win in Protestant America. And he needs, in the early primary states, to defeat Hubert Humphrey. West Virginia was supposed to be Humphrey's territory. It was poor, largely Protestant, heavily Union. Exactly the kind of state where a Catholic candidate from Massachusetts might expect to struggle. Humphrey poured resources into West Virginia. He counted on winning it. He lost badly. Kennedy won West Virginia with 60% of the vote. How? Part of it was Kennedy's genuine appeal. Part of it was his family's extraordinary wealth, which funded a massive advertising campaign, and part of it, a documented, historically acknowledged part of it, was Sam Giancana and the Chicago outfit. The mob's relationship with West Virginia was rooted in labor. The United Mine Workers had, over decades, developed relationships with organized crime that were extensive and complex. The mob had people in the coal counties. They had relationships with local political figures. And through Frank Sinatra, Kennedy's friend, the chairman of the board, the man whose Rat Pack made the new frontier glamorous, those relationships had been activated on Kennedy's behalf. Sinatra was the bridge. He was genuine friend of Kennedy's, dazzled by the Kennedy glamour and energy. He was also a genuine friend of Giancana's, sharing with him a world of Las Vegas and late nights and women, and the particular thrill of proximity to power. Sinatra introduced these two worlds to each other. He made Giancana available to the Kennedy campaign. He made himself the conduit through which favors were asked and obligations were incurred. Giancana delivered in West Virginia the exact mechanisms: cash payments to local political bosses, voter mobilization through mob-connected union networks. Possibly more direct forms of electoral manipulation are not fully documented, but the result was real. Kennedy won. Humphrey withdrew from the race. But West Virginia was a prelude. The main event was Illinois. The 1960 general election was one of the closest in American history. Kennedy defeated Richard Nixon by a margin of just 112,827 votes in the popular vote, less than 0.2% of the total ballots cast. The Electoral College margin was similarly thin. Illinois, with its 27 electoral votes, was essential. Kennedy carried Illinois by 8,858 votes out of 4. 7 million cast. Chicago's Cook County delivered that margin. In Cook County, Kennedy ran up numbers that were, by any reasonable analysis, suspiciously large. Precincts where more votes were counted than there were registered voters. Ballots that were, in some cases, visibly altered or manufactured. The Chicago electoral machine, which Giancana's outfit thoroughly penetrated, was operating at full capacity on Kennedy's behalf. Richard Nixon considered challenging the Illinois result. He ultimately decided not to. Whether that decision was right or wrong, it left in place a Kennedy presidency that owed, in some meaningful measure, its existence to the Chicago outfit. Giancana believed, genuinely, profoundly believed, that he had made John Kennedy president. In conversations recorded by FBI surveillance bugs, he returned to this theme repeatedly. He had delivered Illinois. He had activated networks in West Virginia. He had, through Sinatra and other intermediaries, worked to ensure that the right people supported the right candidate. And now, he expected something in return. The mob's expectation was simple and specific. Robert Kennedy, JFK's brother and campaign manager, was about to become Attorney General of the United States. Bobby Kennedy had, as chief counsel to the Senate Rackets Committee in the late 1950s, built a personal crusade against organized crime in general, and specific mob figures in particular. He had interrogated Jimmy Hoffa with barely concealed hatred. He had built cases against Carlos Marcello. He had made the destruction of the mob his personal mission in a way that went beyond mere professional obligation. It was visceral for Bobby Kennedy, personal. The mob's expectation was that, now that JFK was in the White House, Bobby would back off, that the political debt incurred in Chicago and West Virginia would translate into protection, that the new administration would find other priorities. What actually happened was the opposite. Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, launched the most aggressive federal campaign against organized crime in American history. The number of federal indictments of mob figures tripled in the first year of the Kennedy administration compared to the previous year. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, who did not like the mob investigations but liked Bobby Kennedy even less, and was nonetheless compelled by the attorney generals. Direct orders to participate installed. Surveillance bugs in mob meeting places across the country. Grand juries were convened. Cases were built. Carlos Marcello was deported, physically seized by federal agents, put on a plane, and dropped in Guatemala, a country where he had fraudulently claimed citizenship. This was not a subtle message. This was an act of deliberate humiliation, directed at one of the most powerful men in America, Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters boss and mob ally who Bobby Kennedy had been pursuing since the Rackets Committee days, was indicted, then indicted again. RFK assigned a team of attorneys, the Get Hoffa Squad, whose sole purpose was to build a case that would put James Riddle Hoffa in federal prison. Hoffa, who was simultaneously stealing from the Teamsters pension fund and funneling mob-connected loans from that fund to organized crime figures, called Bobby Kennedy a little shrimp and a damn spoiled brat, and vowed to destroy him. The feeling was mutual. Sam Giancana's home, his cars, his restaurants, his golf games were under constant FBI surveillance. Agents followed him everywhere. When Giancana complained to a federal judge about the harassment, Bobby Kennedy sent his people to court to argue that the surveillance would continue. The judge sided with the government. The mob had expected gratitude. They received prosecution. In Carlos Marcello's world, there was a saying, a Sicilian proverb, translated and adapted for American organized crime. If a dog is causing you trouble, you do not cut off the tail. You cut off the head in the FBI's files? There is a documented report from an informant named Edward Becker, a business associate of Marcello's, who met with him in September 1962 at Marcello's sprawling Churchill Farms estate outside New Orleans. According to Becker, Marcello was enraged, specifically about Robert Kennedy's aggressive prosecution of him, and he made a statement that Becker would later report to federal authorities. According to informant Edward Becker, Marcello said in 1962 something like, "cut off the dog's head," referring to President Kennedy, with RFK as the tail, so the dog would stop causing trouble. The meaning was not subtle. Marcello had strong motive. RFK had tried to deport him, but whether this was a direct order or mere venting remains unproven. Robert Kennedy's authority derived entirely from his brother. Without the president, the Attorney General was just another lawyer. Kill the president, and the investigation stops. The mob's fury had a name and a date. The date was November 22, 1963, and the name was Jack Kennedy. But before we get there, we need to understand Cuba, because Cuba is the key to everything. January 1st, 1959, Fulgencio Batista flees Cuba. Fidel Castro's guerrilla forces enter Havana. The revolution is complete. For the American government, this is alarming. A communist-allied government 90 miles off the Florida coast is a Cold War catastrophe in slow motion. For the American Mafia, it is something more immediate. It is financial catastrophe in real time. Meyer Lansky had invested enormous personal and organizational capital in building the Havana casino operation. He had spent years cultivating Batista, negotiating terms, constructing the financial structures that allowed mob money to flow into Cuban hospitality and out again, laundered and multiplied. The hotels were profitable beyond almost any other mob investment. The Riviera alone, which Lansky personally oversaw, was generating profits that dwarfed most domestic operations. Santo Traficante Jr. had been on the ground in Havana, running the casino operations, his relationships with Cuban politicians, police, and business figures were extensive. He spoke Spanish. He understood the territory. Cuba was not merely a business for Traficante. It was a domain he had mastered. When Castro shut down the casinos, Traficante was briefly imprisoned. He was held at the Trescornia detention camp outside Havana. How long he was held, and why he was ultimately released rather than tried and further imprisoned, generated speculation that would follow him for the rest of his life. One visitor to Traficante during his Cuban detention was a man named Jack Ruby, a Dallas nightclub owner with Chicago roots and mob connections. Ruby visited Traficante in Cuba in 1959. The purpose and content of that visit were never satisfactorily explained, but set that aside for now. Castro's revolution cost the mob, by various estimates, between $200 million and $400 million in assets and future revenue. This was an injury that demanded a response. And in the peculiar world of early 1960s American political criminal intersection, the response came in the form of a joint venture between the CIA and organized crime. Operation Mongoose, the CIA's umbrella program for operations against Castro. Within Mongoose, the assassination planning was codenamed ZR Rifle. The operational approach was to use the CIA's existing relationships with organized crime, relationships that had been building since at least 1959, to arrange Castro's murder. The logic was straightforward. In its dark way, the mob had networks in Cuba. They had Cuban exile contacts who were motivated by a mix of anti-communism and a desire to recover their lost investments. They had experience with organized, deniable violence. The CIA had operational authority and funding, but lacked the ground-level connections. Together, they could do what neither could do alone. The key CIA figure was William Harvey, a heavyset, hard-drinking former FBI agent who ran ZR Rifle. Harvey's CIA contact on the mob side was Johnny Roselli. Roselli was a fascinating figure. Born Filippo Sacco in Esperia, Italy. He had immigrated to the United States as a child and reinvented himself as a sleek, sophisticated operator who moved comfortably between the mob world and the legitimate world of Las Vegas entertainment. He was not a boss in the formal sense. He answered to Giancana and the outfit's leadership, but he was trusted, discreet, and had connections that extended in multiple directions at once. He was the perfect intermediary. Roselli brought in Giancana and Trafficante as operational partners. Poison pills were developed. CIA-supplied compounds that could theoretically be slipped into Castro's food or drink. Weapons were discussed. A Cuban network of contacts willing to make the attempt was assembled. Multiple attempts were made. Multiple plots were developed. Castro survived all of them. But something important happened in the process of these plots that is often overlooked in the focus on whether any particular attempt came close to success. The CIA and the mob developed an intimate working relationship. They shared secrets. They developed mutual obligations. They knew things about each other. In intelligence terminology, this creates leverage, mutual assured destruction, but for reputations and freedom rather than cities. The CIA could not publicly disclose its partnership with organized crime without devastating itself. The mob could not disclose its partnership with the CIA without destroying whatever legal protection it had and potentially triggering prosecutions. They were bound together. April 17, 1961, the Bay of Pigs. A CIA-trained force of approximately 1,400 Cuban exiles landed at Playa Girón on the southern coast of Cuba. The operation had been planned under Eisenhower and inherited by Kennedy. Its success depended, in part, on American air support, neutralizing Castro's small air force in the critical hours before the landing. Kennedy authorized a limited airstrike before the landing. But when the operation began to go wrong, when it became clear that the exile force was not going to overwhelm Castro's defenses quickly, when international pressure mounted, when the Soviet response looked potentially dangerous, Kennedy refused to authorize the additional airstrikes that the CIA and the exile military commanders were begging for. The invasion failed completely. The exile brigade was captured. More than 100 men died. The survivors spent years in Cuban prisons before being ransomed back to the United States. Kennedy accepted public responsibility for the disaster. "Victory has 1,000 fathers," he said. "But defeat is an orphan," he blamed himself, but privately. The anger was directed elsewhere, at the CIA, which Kennedy believed had manipulated him into the operation with false assurances of its viability, at the Joint Chiefs, who had told him it could succeed. Kennedy, in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, told aides that he wanted to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the winds. He fired Allen Dulles, the CIA director. He fired Deputy Director Richard Beazle. He began the process of restructuring the CIA's relationship with the White House. The CIA was furious. The old guard, the Dulles generation, the men who believed in aggressive covert action against communism without presidential interference, felt betrayed. They believed Kennedy had abandoned brave men on that beach to save his own political skin. The Cuban exile community felt something even more personal. These were men who had left their homes, their families, their country. They had trained in Guatemala, had been promised American support, had been told that this was their moment, and then, in their moment of need, with their brothers dying on the beach, the American president had withheld the air power that could have saved them. Kennedy left our men to die on that beach. This was not rhetoric. This was how the exile community processed the Bay of Pigs, personally, as a betrayal, and the mob shared that feeling, not because they cared about the exiles' patriotism, but because the exiles were their network. The people who were supposed to go back to Cuba and reopen the casinos. The failure of the Bay of Pigs meant the failure of the Cuba Restoration Project. It meant the continued loss of hundreds of millions of dollars. It meant Castro remained in power. Kennedy had failed them. Then came the missile crisis. In October 1962, Kennedy faced down the Soviet installation of nuclear missiles in Cuba. His handling of the crisis, navigating between military advisors who wanted immediate airstrikes and an understanding that such strikes might trigger nuclear war, is widely regarded as one of the great moments of presidential statecraft in American history. But the resolution of the crisis contained a secret element that enraged the CIA, the exile community, and their mob allies. As part of the deal that ended the crisis, Kennedy gave the Soviet Union a secret pledge not to invade Cuba, not to support another attempt to overthrow Castro by force. For the CIA hawks, this was capitulation. For the exile community, it was a death sentence for their dream of returning home. For the mob, it was the final confirmation that Cuba was gone, that Meyer Lansky's Riviera, Traficante's casinos, Marcello's interests, all of it, were never coming back as long as Kennedy was president. And now, running parallel to all of this, Bobby Kennedy was prosecuting them, deporting them, harassing them, building cases against them. The equation was becoming simple. Kennedy was their enemy. Kennedy had to go Santo Traficante. The quiet, careful, methodical boss of Tampa made a statement that was documented by a Cuban contact named Jose Ailman in the early 1960s. Ailman, who was trying to arrange a loan from the Teamsters Pension Fund through Traficante's connections, reported that Traficante had said, clearly, without ambiguity, that President Kennedy would be hit. Ailman told the FBI recorded it. The warning, apparently, went nowhere. Carlos Marcello was born Calogero Menacori in Tunisia in 1910. To Sicilian parents, his family immigrated to Louisiana when he was a child. He grew up in the Italian immigrant community of New Orleans. In the world of poverty and marginality that the American immigrant experience often meant in that era, he left school at 14. He was arrested for the first time at 20. For armed robbery, he was arrested many times after that. He was convicted rarely. He was imprisoned even more rarely. And across 40 years of criminal enterprise, he built an organization that controlled, by FBI estimates, the organized crime operations across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and a substantial portion of Texas, including, critically, Dallas. By 1963, Marcello was worth, by various estimates, between $300 million and $1 billion. He owned real estate. He owned restaurants. He owned strip clubs and legitimate clubs and bars and hotels. He owned politicians. He owned judges in Louisiana, which had a long tradition of colorful and creative political corruption. Marcello was not merely a criminal figure. He was an institution. His base of operations was a complex called Churchill Farms, a 3,000-acre estate outside New Orleans that served as meeting place, home and power center. According to FBI informant Edward Becker, Marcello made a statement in 1962 about cutting off the dog's head, referring to President Kennedy, with RFK as the tail, so the dog would stop causing trouble. The House Select Committee on Assassinations found Marcello had the motive, means, and opportunity to participate in a conspiracy, but was unable to establish direct evidence of his complicity. Becker's account, corroborated by a second witness who was also present, was taken seriously by some federal investigators. The House Select Committee on Assassinations which reinvestigated the Kennedy assassination in 1976 through 1979 and produced its landmark report, concluded that Marcello had the motive, the means, and the opportunity to plan the assassination. The geography is important. Marcello's territory included Dallas. The organized crime network in Dallas operated under Marcello's umbrella. The nightclub world of Dallas, the strip clubs, the gambling operations, the late-night establishments where money moved in ways it was not supposed to, was part of Marcello's empire. Jack Ruby owned a nightclub in Dallas, 2 nightclubs. Actually, the Carousel Club and a smaller establishment called the Vegas Club. Ruby was not a major figure. He was a mid-level operator, well known to the Dallas Police Department, connected to the world of nightclubs and entertainment that intersected with Marcello's operations. Ruby's connections to Marcello's network were documented. His relationship with Dallas's mob-connected figures was established. Ruby's connection to Marcello's world was one thread. There were others. Lee Harvey Oswald, the man officially accused of killing Kennedy, had grown up in New Orleans. His uncle, a man named Charles Dutz Morit, was a low-level bookmaker who worked within Marcello's gambling network. Oswald had been raised partly by Morit and had ongoing contact with him as an adult. Oswald's presence in New Orleans in the summer of 1963, during which time he was distributing pro-Castro literature on the streets, apparently positioning himself as a left-wing activist, was in the heart of Marcello's territory. Also in New Orleans was a man named David Ferry. Ferry was an airline pilot who had been fired from Eastern Airlines for what the airline described as homosexual activities involving a minor. He was brilliant, eccentric, and deeply connected to the anti-Castro Cuban exile world in New Orleans. He had also, records showed, worked as an investigator for one of Marcello's attorneys. Ferry knew Oswald. They had been in the same Civil Air Patrol unit in the 1950s when Oswald was a teenager. Carlos Marcello, Jack Ruby, Lee Harvey Oswald, David Ferry. These names form a web of connections that converges on Dallas in November 1963. The House Select Committee investigated this web extensively. Their conclusion that Marcello probably participated in a conspiracy to assassinate Kennedy was the most significant official pronouncement on the assassination since the Warren Commission's lone gunman conclusion in 1964. Marcello, when questioned about these matters over the years, consistently denied everything. He had never threatened Kennedy. He had never known Oswald. He had no idea what people were talking about. He died in 1993 at the age of 83, severely debilitated by Alzheimer's disease. Whatever he knew, whatever he had done or arranged or set in motion, he took it with him. Almost all of it, because in the early 1980s, while Marcello was serving time in federal prison for a racketeering conviction, an FBI informant named Jack Van Lanningham reported that Marcello had made admissions about Kennedy's assassination during private conversations in their shared cell. According to Van Lanningham, whose account was documented in FBI files that remained classified for years, Marcello had expressed satisfaction about the assassination and had made statements suggesting his involvement. Van Lanningham's account was never independently corroborated. Marcello's family denied everything, but it sits in the record. Another thread in a very large, very dark tapestry. If Carlos Marcello was the most dangerous man in America, Santo Traficante Jr. was perhaps the most dangerous man. No one was watching closely enough. Where Marcello was territorial and volatile, a man who expressed his rage openly, who made threats in front of witnesses, whose empire was geographically defined and defensively held, Traficante was something else. He was quiet. He was controlled. He was methodical. He had the patience of a man who had learned, growing up in the Tampa mob world created by his father. that patience was the most valuable criminal tool. Santo Trafficante Sr. had built the Tampa organization from nothing in the early 20th century. When he died in 1954, his son inherited an operation that extended from Florida through the southeast and into Cuba. Trafficante Jr. expanded the family business into heroin trafficking, a revenue stream that made the gambling and loan sharking operations look modest by comparison. The heroin came from Southeast Asia and the Middle East, moved through European criminal networks, and arrived in the United States through a distribution system that Trafficante helped build and maintain. He was also uniquely among the major mob bosses, a man with deep operational intelligence experience. His work with the CIA on the Castro assassination plots had given him a window into the world of professional, deniable killing that most criminals, even powerful ones, never accessed. He understood how intelligence operations worked. He understood how to use cutouts, intermediaries, and deniable networks. He understood operational security. These skills would prove, potentially, very relevant. Trafficante's Cuba connections were the deepest and most personal of any American mob figure. He had lived in Havana. He had run the casino operations. He had been imprisoned by Castro. And when the CIA came to him with the Castro assassination plots, he had engaged not merely as a business transaction, but as a man with a genuine personal score to settle. His connection to Jack Ruby, documented by the fact of Ruby's visit to him in a Cuban detention camp in 1959, was never fully explained. Ruby, when asked about the visit by the Warren Commission, gave a vague account that satisfied no one. He said he was visiting a friend. He said it was nothing important. The commission, apparently, did not press the matter with sufficient vigor. What was the relationship between the Dallas nightclub owner and the Tampa mob boss? What was discussed in that Cuban prison? The answers were never established with certainty. What is established with certainty is that Trafficante told Jose Ailman in 1962 that Kennedy would be hit, that this statement was reported to the FBI, that the FBI apparently did not act on it with any urgency, and that Kennedy was, in fact, hit. Trafficante survived longer than almost any of his contemporaries. He died in March 1987 on a hospital operating table during heart surgery. He was 72 years old, but before he died, his longtime personal attorney, Frank Ragano, claimed that Trafficante had made a deathbed confession of sorts. Ragano, who had also represented Jimmy Hoffa, and who had his own complicated history with these events, wrote that Trafficante told him in his final months, "We shouldn't have killed John. We should have killed Bobby." Ragano's account was disputed. His credibility was questioned, but the statement, attributed to a dying man who had nothing left to protect, has haunted Kennedy assassination scholarship for decades. Santo Trafficante Jr. went to his grave having never been charged with anything related to the Kennedy assassination. He had been too careful, too quiet, too patient. The silent assassin, if that is what he was silent to the end. Salvatore Giancana was born in Chicago in 1908, the son of Sicilian immigrants. He grew up in the near West Side's Little Italy neighborhood in poverty, and found his way into the Chicago criminal world through the natural path of street-level theft and violence. He was arrested for murder as a teenager, but the case was dropped. He became a driver for the outfit. He rose through the organization. By 1957, he was the boss of the Chicago outfit, one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the United States. Giancana was, by most accounts, a complicated and contradictory figure. He was genuinely intelligent, with a gift for organizational management that translated easily from crime to legitimate business, the two categories overlapping extensively in his world. He was capable of charm and humor. He enjoyed the company of entertainers and celebrities. He liked Frank Sinatra. He was genuinely fond of golf. He was also capable of extraordinary violence. He had ordered killings. He had participated in killings. Personally, when he was younger, the organization he ran enforced its authority with murder, and Giancana was the ultimate authority in that organization. His personal life was, in certain respects, the most explosive of any American mob boss. He had a relationship with a woman named Judith Campbell, later Judith Exner, who was simultaneously in a relationship with John F. Kennedy. This was not a minor personal detail. This was a national security catastrophe in waiting. Kennedy and Exner had met in 1960, introduced by Sinatra. Their relationship was documented by the Church Committee's investigation in 1975. Exner later claimed that she had served as a courier between Kennedy and Giancana, carrying messages and possibly other items between the president and the mob boss. If true, this meant that the President of the United States was using his mistress as a liaison to organized crime. Exner's account was disputed. Her credibility was challenged. But the basic fact of her concurrent relationships with both Kennedy and Giancana was established. J. Edgar Hoover knew about it. He briefed Kennedy on it in March 1962, a meeting that was presumably deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. Kennedy's relationship with Exner ended shortly after that meeting. Giancana's rage at the Kennedys was, in some ways, the most personal of the three bosses. It was not merely the prosecution, though the prosecution was real and continuous and intensely irritating. It was the betrayal. Giancana genuinely believed that he had made Kennedy president. He had delivered Chicago. He had used his network, his money, his organizational capacity on Kennedy's behalf. And what he received in return was FBI bugs in his home and an attorney general who seemed to want him in prison more than he wanted anything else in the world. In FBI surveillance recordings from the early 1960s, recordings made by the bugs that Bobby Kennedy had authorized, the same bugs that were an ongoing source of Giancana's rage. There are conversations in which Giancana expresses his fury in terms that go beyond ordinary criminal complaint. He felt personally wronged, personally dishonored. The Kennedys had violated the code. They had taken what the mob offered and given nothing back. "If I told you what we did for that family," he said in one recorded conversation, the sentence trailing off into implications that are not hard to read. What happened to Sam Giancana illuminates with terrible clarity the dark currents running through the summer of 1975. By 1975, organized crime's relationship with American government had become a public scandal. The Church Committee, formerly the Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with respect to intelligence activities, chaired by Senator Frank Church of Idaho, was investigating CIA assassination plots, domestic surveillance abuses, and the CIA mob partnership. For the first time, some of the deepest secrets of the Kennedy era were going to be aired in public. Giancana had been subpoenaed to testify. He was living in Mexico, having left the United States to avoid both prosecution and enemies. He returned to Chicago on the evening of June 19, 1975. Sam Giancana was in the basement of his Oak Park home. He was cooking. He had a small saucepan on the stove, frying sausages, peppers, and escarole. He was in a domestic, unhurried moment. Someone he trusted was also in the basement, because the door was not forced and there were no signs of struggle. Investigators concluded that Giancana knew his killer. He was shot once in the back of the head. Then, as he fell, he was shot 6 more times in a circle around the chin. A professional pattern, designed not just to kill, but to send a message. The traditional mob execution style for someone who has been convicted. Internally of talking, he died on his kitchen floor, surrounded by sausage and olive oil. He never testified before the Church Committee. He never told his full story. He took Chicago's darkest secrets with him into that kitchen floor. Johnny Roselli, the mob's CIA liaison, who was also scheduled to testify before the church committee, survived Giancana by almost exactly 1 year. In July 1976, Roselli's body was found in a 55-gallon oil drum floating in Dumfoundling Bay near Miami. His legs had been sawed off and stuffed into the drum along with his torso. His remains showed signs that he had been strangled and then shot. He had testified before the church committee in April 1976. He had been careful about what he said, but he had said some things, and someone had decided that even what he'd said was too much. The pattern was unmistakable. The witnesses who knew the most about the CIA mob partnership, about the assassination plots, about November 1963, were being silenced before they could fully speak. And the silencing was being done in the organized crime style that made attribution almost impossible. The lone gunman theory depends entirely on Lee Harvey Oswald. He is the official answer to the question of who killed Kennedy. A 24-year-old former Marine with a mail-order rifle and a grudge that the Warren Commission described in terms that painted him as a politically motivated loner. A man who had defected to the Soviet Union and been allowed to return. A man who, 2 days after allegedly killing the president, was himself murdered in the basement of the Dallas Police Department by a man named Jack Ruby. The official story is internally consistent. Just barely. The anomalies, however, are numerous, significant, and have never been satisfactorily resolved. Start with the biography, because it is genuinely strange. Lee Harvey Oswald was born in New Orleans in 1939. His father had died before his birth. He was raised by his mother, a woman who moved the family frequently, living in New Orleans, Fort Worth, and New York during Oswald's childhood. He was a loner, bookish, and socially awkward, who developed an interest in Marxist ideology as a teenager that he maintained throughout his short life. He served at Atsugi Air Base in Japan, a site used for the CIA's U-2 spy plane program. Some researchers have speculated about possible CIA contact with Oswald there, but official investigations, including the Warren Commission and HSCA, found no evidence of any such involvement. His security clearance was higher than what his formal assignment would have required. In September 1959, Oswald was discharged from the Marines under what would later be described as hardship, circumstances that were granted with unusual speed. In October 1959, he appeared at the American Embassy in Moscow and announced his intention to defect to the Soviet Union. He renounced his American citizenship. He offered to provide the Soviets with information about American radar systems. He was allowed to stay in the Soviet Union. He was given a job in a radio factory in Minsk. He married a Russian woman named Marina Prusakov, and in June 1962, after writing to the American Embassy, expressing a desire to return, he was allowed to come back with his Soviet wife Marina. He was interviewed by the FBI upon return as part of standard defector processing. Official investigations found no evidence of special treatment or CIA involvement in his return. No prosecution, no loss of passport. People who defected to the Soviet Union and then returned were not, in the ordinary course of Cold War events, welcomed home without consequence. They were interrogated. They were investigated. The assumption was that they had been turned, or at minimum had provided useful intelligence to the Soviets during their time abroad. Oswald was apparently questioned by the FBI and then largely left alone. Why? One persistent theory, never proven, always relevant, is that Oswald was not a genuine defector, that his defection was a cover story, a false flag operation in which an agent was sent to the Soviet Union with the appearance of defection in order to penetrate Soviet intelligence, that his smooth return to the United States was facilitated by the CIA, which was running him. This theory cannot be confirmed or refuted with currently available evidence. It fits some of the facts. It fits others poorly. What can be said is that Oswald's biography has enough anomalies to make the official story lone. Ideologically motivated defector and lone. Ideologically motivated assassin feel incomplete. After returning to the United States, Oswald eventually settled back in New Orleans in the spring of 1963. He obtained a job with a coffee company called the Reilly Coffee Company, and he began engaging in political activity. He created a chapter of an organization called the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, an organization that supported Castro's Cuba and opposed American hostility toward it. He printed leaflets. He stood on New Orleans street corners and distributed those leaflets. He got into a televised altercation with anti-Castro Cuban exile activists. He appeared on a local radio program to debate the Cuba issue from a pro-Castro perspective. All of this was deeply strange behavior for a man who had recently been investigated for his eyes, Soviet connections, and who was under nominal FBI supervision. You do not go to the Soviet Union, return, and then publicly agitate for Castro's Cuba if you are trying to stay under law enforcement radar. You do not make yourself visible and identifiable as a leftist agitator unless you are being set up as a leftist agitator. Unless someone wanted Lee Harvey Oswald to have a very clear, very visible public identity as a communist sympathizer, someone who would look, in retrospect, like exactly the kind of politically motivated lone gunman who might shoot a conservative president. He considered an enemy of Cuba and the Soviet Union. The New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee had an address, 544 Camp Street. That address was also the address, same building, different entrance, of the offices of a man named Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister was a former FBI special agent in charge of the Chicago field office. He was, by 1963, a fierce anti-communist, a supporter of various right-wing and anti-Castro causes, and an operator who moved in the world where FBI, CIA, and organized crime networks intersected. He had relationships with the Cuban exile community. He had relationships with Carlos Marcello's network. He was, in the assessment of later investigators, deeply embedded in the New Orleans covert operations world. Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba leaflets were printed with 544 Camp Street as their address. Oswald was distributing pro-Castro literature from the same building where Guy Bannister was running anti-Castro operations. This contradiction has never been resolved. Various explanations have been offered. None of them fully satisfies. And then there is David Ferrie. David William Ferrie was one of the most unusual figures in the entire Kennedy assassination story. He was a former Eastern Airlines pilot who had been fired for misconduct. He was a self-taught amateur cancer researcher. He was deeply involved in anti-Castro activities and had trained Cuban exiles in guerrilla tactics. He was a vehement anti-communist and a man of violent political passions. He was also deeply strange in his personal presentation. He had lost all his body hair to a medical condition and wore crude, painted-on eyebrows and an ill-fitting red wig. Ferrie had known Oswald since the mid-1950s, when both were involved in the Civil Air Patrol in New Orleans, and Oswald was a teenager. Ferrie was a cap officer. Oswald was a cadet. Photographs confirm that they were in the same unit at the same time. Ferrie worked as an investigator for G. Ray Gill, one of Carlos Marcello's attorneys. He had been involved in flights on Marcello's behalf. He was, by any reasonable assessment, connected to the Marcello organization. On the day of the Kennedy assassination, November 22, 1963, Ferrie drove from New Orleans to Houston, Texas, and then to Galveston. He had 3 companions. They drove through the night. When asked about this trip later, Ferrie gave various explanations. He was going goose hunting. He was going ice skating. That did not entirely cohere. The timing was remarkable. On the day the president was killed, David Ferry, who knew Lee Harvey Oswald, who worked for Carlos Marcello's lawyer, who was deeply embedded in the New Orleans-Dallas operational world, took a midnight drive to Texas. Ferry was briefly detained and questioned by the district attorney's office in New Orleans in the days after the assassination. He was released. He continued his life. In February 1967, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison announced that he was reopening the Kennedy assassination investigation. He had Ferry in his sights as a key witness. On February 22, 1967, David Ferry was found dead in his apartment in New Orleans. The coroner's report cited a berry aneurysm, a natural cause. There was no evidence of foul play that could be established conclusively. But Ferry had also left behind 2 unsigned, undated notes that read like suicide notes or farewell letters. He died before Garrison could interview him under oath. Another witness silenced. The question of Oswald's role. Was he a genuine lone gunman? A patsy set up by others to take the blame? A participant in a larger conspiracy? Or some combination of these? Has never been definitively resolved. What is clear is that his biography had been carefully constructed in the 2 years before Dallas, into the profile of a communist sympathizer with a grievance against Kennedy, his public agitation for Cuba, his visible connection to the pro-Castro left, the paper trail of his Soviet connections. When he was arrested in Dallas on the afternoon of November 22, 1963, and asked by reporters what was happening, Oswald said, "I'm just a patsy." He did not say, "I am innocent." He did not say, "I didn't do it." He said, "I'm just a patsy." He had 2 days to elaborate on that statement. 2 days in which the Dallas Police Department held him, interrogated him, and prepared to charge him. 2 days in which the world watched to see what would happen next. And then Jack Ruby walked into the basement of the Dallas Police Department on November 24, 1963, and shot Lee Harvey Oswald in the stomach. And the question of what Lee Harvey Oswald knew, and who he was working for, or with, and what he meant when he called himself a patsy, all of it died with him on a hospital table. His real name was Jacob Leon Rubinstein. He was born in Chicago in 1911, the 5th of 8 children of Polish-Jewish immigrants. He grew up in the Maxwell Street neighborhood, one of the poorest and most densely populated areas of Chicago, a world of pushcart vendors and street markets, and running through it all like a dark river, the organized crime networks that had grown powerful during Prohibition. Ruby grew up knowing mobsters, not in a theoretical way. In the way you know the neighbors whose doors you might occasionally knock on, the men who ran the gambling in the neighborhood, the people who occupied the specific social world of working-class urban crime. He moved to Dallas in 1947. He became a nightclub operator. He ran the Silver Spur Club, and later the Carousel Club, a strip club on Commerce Street that was, by the standards of the Dallas nightclub world, a reasonably successful operation. He knew policemen, many policemen. By his own account, and theirs, he had easy, casual access to the Dallas Police Department. He knew detectives by name. He dropped in to visit them. He brought them steaks and coffee. He was a familiar face. He was also, in ways that were more significant than his public profile suggested, connected to organized crime. In the weeks before Kennedy's assassination, in the period roughly from September through November 1963, Ruby's phone records showed a dramatic spike in calls to organized crime figures across the country. He called Irwin Weiner, a Chicago bondsman with mob connections. He called Barney Baker, a labor organizer associated with Jimmy Hoffa. He called Nofio Picora, a Marcello associate in New Orleans. He called Murray Miller, a Teamsters official. He called Robert Baker, another Hoffa associate. Why was a Dallas strip club owner calling mob-connected figures across the country in the 2 months before the assassination. The Warren Commission did not find a satisfying answer. They noted the calls. They did not fully explain them. Ruby was also known to the local Marcello network. His position in the Dallas nightclub world, which, as previously noted, operated within Marcello's territorial sphere, gave him relationships with figures who were connected upward to the New Orleans organization. He was not a major player. He was the kind of mid-level, peripherally connected figure that organized crime networks maintained in multiple cities. Useful, disposable, loyal through a combination of genuine affiliation and the kind of debt and obligation that the mob world generated naturally. On November 22, 1963, Ruby was, by his own account, devastated by Kennedy's assassination. He closed his clubs out of respect. He was visibly upset. He appeared, to people who encountered him in those hours, to be genuinely grieving. On November 23rd, Ruby was at Dallas Police Headquarters, mingling with reporters and law enforcement. He was, by multiple accounts, present during Oswald's transfer to county jail, a transfer that did not ultimately happen on that day. He was close enough to Oswald at one point, witnesses said, to have shot him. He did not shoot him on November 23rd. On November 24, 1963, at approximately 11:21 a.m., the Dallas Police Department began the process of transferring Lee Harvey Oswald from the city jail to the county jail. The transfer was conducted in the basement of the police building. Reporters and cameras were present. The police had allowed the media to witness the transfer. Ruby was in the basement. How he got there has never been fully explained. He had no official reason to be there. He was not a law enforcement officer. He was not a credentialed journalist. He had driven to the building, parked nearby, walked down a ramp, and found himself in the basement as the transfer was beginning. As Oswald was walked through the crowd, Ruby stepped forward and shot him once in the abdomen with a .38 caliber revolver. Oswald died at Parkland Memorial Hospital at 1:07 p.m. on November 24, 1963, the same hospital where Kennedy had been pronounced dead 48 hours earlier. Ruby was immediately arrested. He was convicted of murder in March 1964. He was sentenced to death, but the conviction was appealed. And before a retrial could occur, Ruby developed what appeared to be rapidly spreading cancer. He was hospitalized in December 1966. He died on January 3, 1967. In between his conviction and his death, Ruby made several statements that became, in subsequent decades, among the most analyzed utterances of the entire Kennedy era. He repeatedly asked to be transferred to Washington. He said he wanted to tell the full truth, but that he could not do so in Dallas. He implied, with a persistence that his questioners could not entirely dismiss, that his life was in danger and that he would be killed before he could tell everything. In June 1964, when the Warren Commission came to Dallas to take Ruby's testimony, he made a plea directly to Chief Justice Earl Warren. He said, "Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred. My motives." Warren said there was no way to bring Ruby to Washington. Ruby responded, "Then I can't tell you, but I would like to tell the truth. And I can't tell it here. My life is in danger here. Do I sound screwy in telling you this?" He was not taken to Washington. He did not tell the full truth. He died in a Dallas jail before any retrial could begin. Whether Ruby killed Oswald because the mob told him to, because someone, Marcello or Trafficante, or someone acting for them, had ordered the cleanup, or because he was genuinely, impulsively acting on his own grief and rage, is a question that his death left permanently open. What is not open to serious question is this: Ruby had cultivated relationships with Dallas police officers over years, giving him unusual access to the basement during Oswald's transfer. The Warren Commission concluded Ruby acted impulsively out of grief and anger. The House Select Committee found no evidence of a mob-directed plot to silence Oswald through Ruby. Though Ruby's connections to low-level mob figures were documented, the machinery of it, the improbability of it, the convenience of it is impossible to fully dismiss as coincidence. Within an hour of Kennedy's assassination, before Lee Harvey Oswald had been identified, before any real investigation had begun, Edgar Hoover called Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who had just learned that his brother had been shot, who was standing in his backyard in Virginia when he got the call, who was in the first terrible minutes of the worst day of his life. Listened as Hoover told him the news in a tone that witnesses described as oddly flat, almost clinical. Hoover did not, by Robert Kennedy's subsequent account, display any particular emotion. He reported the facts. Kennedy was dead. A suspect had been identified. Within hours of the assassination, Hoover was declaring to other federal officials that Oswald had acted alone. Before Oswald had been charged, before his fingerprints had been definitively matched to the rifle, before any real forensic analysis had been completed, before anyone had seriously investigated whether other people might have been involved, Oswald acted alone. The case was closed. This extraordinary rush to conclusion by the nation's chief law enforcement officer has generated analysis and speculation for 6 decades. Why was Hoover so certain, so quickly? Why was he so insistent on the lone gunman conclusion at a time when any professional investigator would have said the evidence was far too preliminary for any such judgment? The answers that history has provided, partial, inferential, impossible to fully confirm, are not reassuring. Hoover's relationship with the Kennedys was one of the most complicated and toxic in American political history. He had been FBI director since 1924. For almost 40 years, he had accumulated power by accumulating secrets. He kept files on politicians. He kept files on civil rights leaders. He kept files on journalists and academics and activists. These files were, by all accounts, his insurance policy, his guarantee that no administration could fire him, no Congress could defund him, no political change could displace him. He knew too much about too many people. He knew a great deal about John Kennedy. He knew about the women. He knew about the health problems. He knew about the Judith Exner situation, the mistress shared with Giancana. He briefed Kennedy on this in March 1962 in a meeting that demonstrated, with uncomfortable clarity, exactly what kind of leverage Hoover carried. He despised Robert Kennedy. This was not merely institutional friction between the director of an agency and his nominal superior. It was personal. Kennedy treated Hoover with barely concealed contempt, insisting that the FBI director report through him rather than directly to the president, demanding action on organized crime in ways that Hoover found both professionally threatening and personally insulting. Hoover, who had spent decades treating FBI anti-mob investigations as a low priority, maintaining, against overwhelming evidence, that there was no such thing as a national organized crime organization, was being forced by Bobby Kennedy to make the mob the Bureau's central focus. For Hoover, this was humiliating. He was 70 years old. He had run the FBI for almost his entire adult life. He was not about to be directed by the president's younger brother. Hoover also had, according to several accounts, relationships with figures in the organized crime world that were compromising in their own right. The most explosive allegation, never definitively proven, is that Meyer Lansky had photographic evidence of Hoover engaging in homosexual activity, evidence that Lansky used to ensure that Hoover kept the FBI away from mob investigations. Hoover was not publicly out, was not known to be gay, and had spent his career in an institution where being gay was grounds for dismissal. If Lansky had leverage of this kind, It would explain a great deal about the FBI's historical reluctance to aggressively pursue the mob. These are allegations. They rest on the testimony of people whose credibility is not unimpeachable. But they are part of the historical record, and they illuminate the complex world of mutual leverage and compromise that characterized the year. Relationships between power and crime in mid-century America. The Warren Commission was established by Lyndon Johnson on November 29, 1963, 1 week after the assassination. Its mandate was to investigate the circumstances of Kennedy's death and report its findings to the nation. The commission was chaired by Chief Justice Earl Warren. Its members included senior politicians, Representative Gerald Ford of Michigan, Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, Senator John Sherman Cooper of Kentucky, Representative Holly Boggs of Louisiana, and 2 private citizens, Allen Dulles, the former CIA director, whom Kennedy had fired after the Bay of Pigs, and John McCloy, a former president of the World Bank with deep intelligence community connections. The appointment of Allen Dulles to the commission investigating the assassination of the president who fired him generated some comment at the time. In retrospect, it seems rather more significant. The commission worked for 10 months. It took testimony from 552 witnesses. It produced a report of more than 800 pages, along with 26 volumes of supporting evidence. It concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had acted alone. The commission's work was marked by several features that subsequent investigators found troubling. The CIA did not fully disclose to the commission the existence of the Castro assassination plots, the CIA mob partnership that created a network of operational connections directly relevant to the assassination's context. The commission did not know that the CIA and the mob had been trying to kill Castro together. It did not know about the Roselli-Giancana Trafficante partnership. It could not therefore investigate the extent to which those relationships might have been relevant. The commission relied heavily on the FBI for investigative work. Hoover's FBI, which had already decided that Oswald acted alone, investigated the assassination in a manner that confirmed its predetermined conclusion. The magic bullet theory, the commission's explanation for how a single anonymous bullet could have passed through Kennedy's back and out his throat, and entered Governor Connolly's body, passed through his chest, shattered his wrist, and lodged in his thigh, was, by any physical analysis, extraordinarily improbable. Ballistic and forensic experts have spent decades arguing about whether this trajectory was physically possible. The debate has never been fully resolved. Witnesses who might have provided testimony contradicting the lone gunman conclusion were sometimes not called. Evidence that might have suggested multiple shooters, including some of the acoustic evidence that would later become central to the House Select Committee's analysis, was not given adequate weight. Lyndon Johnson, privately, was not convinced by his own commission's conclusions. In conversations with members of Congress and journalists that were recorded and have since been made public, LBJ expressed doubts about the lone gunman theory in a 1969 conversation with Walter Cronkite, portions of which were not broadcast at the time. Johnson appeared to suggest that he believed the assassination might have been connected to American operations against foreign leaders, a private man in private conversations saying things he would not say publicly. The 1979 House Select Committee on Assassinations reached a different conclusion than the Warren Commission. The HSCA had access to materials and witnesses that the Warren Commission had not. Its investigation lasted 2.5 years and cost more than $5 million. And its conclusion was stark. The Warren Commission was probably wrong. Kennedy was probably killed as a result of a conspiracy. The HSCA's acoustic evidence, analysis of a Dallas Police Department dictabelt recording that may have captured the sounds of the assassination, suggested that 4 shots had been fired in Dealey Plaza. Not 3. The 4th shot appeared to come from the grassy knoll, not the book depository. This would mean a second gunman. The acoustic evidence was later challenged and re-challenged. The debate about its validity continues, but even setting it aside, the HSCA made several findings of extraordinary significance. The HSCA found that Carlos Marcello had the motive, means, an opportunity to assassinate Kennedy. It found that Santo Trafficante had similar attributes. It found that the CIA had failed to provide the Warren Commission with crucial information. It found that both the CIA and FBI had withheld evidence relevant to the investigation. It concluded that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. It stopped short of identifying the conspirators. The evidence, it said, was insufficient for that. But the conclusion that one man alone, with a mail-order rifle, was not the complete explanation for what happened in Dallas, was the considered judgment of a congressional committee after 2.5 years of investigation. The Warren Commission's lone gunman conclusion was not the final word. It was the official first word, driven by the political imperatives of a traumatized nation that needed closure, delivered by a process that was compromised by the very institutions it was relying on for information. One more element of the cover-up deserves extended attention: the Kennedy assassination files. Thousands of documents related to the assassination were classified by the CIA and other agencies. Under the JFK Records Act of 1992, most of these documents were supposed to be released. The National Archives has been working on this process for decades. As of the most recent release cycles, including releases in 2021 and 2022, thousands of documents have been made public, but thousands more remain partially or fully classified. The reasons given for continued classification involve sources and methods, the standard intelligence community justification for keeping secrets. Some of these justifications are probably legitimate. Some of them, in the context of events from 60 years ago, are almost certainly not. What is in those documents? What secrets are still being protected 6 decades after the assassination that are judged sensitive enough to remain out of public view? The imagination fills the gap that the official record leaves open. The story does not end in Dallas. The story ends in slow motion across the following decades, in hospital rooms and prison cells and basements where men were murdered and bayous where bodies were never found. Carlos Marcello. After the assassination, Marcello continued to run his empire from New Orleans with the same methodical efficiency that had characterized his operation for decades. The federal heat, which had been intense under Bobby Kennedy, diminished after the assassination. Johnson was not hostile to Marcello in the way that Kennedy had been. Hoover's FBI had other priorities. The immediate crisis passed. Marcello spent the 1960s and 1970s expanding and consolidating. His Louisiana empire remained intact. His Texas connections remained. He was investigated periodically. He appeared before grand juries. He survived. In 1981, the FBI caught up with him. An FBI undercover operation, one of the most extensive sting operations in federal law enforcement. History produced evidence that Marcello had tried to bribe a federal judge. He was convicted of racketeering. He was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. It was during this imprisonment that the FBI informant, Jack Van Lanningham, reported hearing Marcello make admissions about Kennedy. These conversations, Van Lanningham said, included Marcello expressing anger at the memory of Robert Kennedy and at least implying that he had been involved in the assassination. The FBI took the reports seriously enough to document them. Whether they were fully investigated is less clear. Marcello was released from prison in 1989. His health was failing. By the early 1990s, he was severely impaired by what appeared to be advanced Alzheimer's disease. He died on March 2, 1993, at the age of 83, at his home in Metairie, Louisiana. He went to his grave. Whatever he knew, he kept Santo Trafficante Jr. Trafficante survived his rivals, survived his CIA partnerships, survived the congressional investigations of the 1970s, and survived into an era when most of the people who might have implicated him were dead or discredited. He continued to run his Florida operation through the 1970s and into the 1980s. He was investigated, but never successfully prosecuted for anything directly related to the Kennedy assassination. His lawyer, Frank Regano, was his constant companion and confidant through these decades. In his last years, Trafficante's health declined. He needed heart surgery. According to Regano, who published his account in a 1994 book after Trafficante's death, Trafficante made statements in his final months that suggested he had been involved in the assassination. "We shouldn't have killed John," Regano reported him saying. "We should have killed Bobby." If true, this was the closest thing to a deathbed confession in the Kennedy assassination story. If true, Trafficante died on March 17, 1987, during heart surgery at a Houston hospital. He was 72. He was buried in Tampa. Sam Giancana, already described above, murdered in his Oak Park kitchen on June 19, 1975. Shot once in the back of the head, then 5 more times around the jaw. Classic mob execution. No one was ever charged. The timing, days before he was scheduled to testify before the church committee, was not considered coincidental by serious investigators. Giancana's daughter, Antoinette, wrote a book about her father. His family maintained, publicly, that he had nothing to do with the Kennedy assassination. The FBI files from Van Laningham's account, the surveillance recordings, the accumulated evidence of his rage at the Kennedy betrayal, all of it pointed in a different direction. He was gone. His secrets largely went with him. Johnny Roselli. Johnny Roselli had already testified before the church committee in April 1976. He had been careful. He had hinted at things rather than stating them directly. He had given the committee enough to understand the broad outlines of the CIA mob relationship without providing the specific details that might have been most dangerous. In July 1976, his body was found in a 55-gallon oil drum in Dunfermline Bay. Near Miami, the drum had been weighted to sink. It had not sunk sufficiently. His legs had been severed and stuffed into the drum with his torso. He had been strangled and shot. No one was ever charged with his murder. The connection between his Senate testimony and his death was noted by the church committee. It was another silencing, another witness gone before he could say everything. Meyer Lansky was, in some ways, the greatest survivor of them all, the man who had helped build the American mob's financial architecture, who had run the Havana casinos, who may have had leverage over J. Edgar Hoover himself, who had touched virtually every significant mob operation for 5 decades. Meyer Lansky died peacefully in his bed. He had managed, through a combination of extraordinary financial sophistication, careful operational security, and possibly the leverage he held over people who could have prosecuted him, to escape prison for most of his life. There was one serious attempt to prosecute him. In the early 1970s, for income tax evasion, he fled to Israel, hoping to claim citizenship under Israel's law of return. Israel declined to grant him citizenship. He returned to the United States. The case fell apart. He died in Miami Beach on January 15, 1983. He was 81 years old, natural causes. His fortune, estimated by the FBI at hundreds of millions of dollars, was never fully found or recovered. Jimmy Hoffa, James Riddle Hoffa, the Teamsters boss whose relationship with organized crime had made him one of Bobby Kennedy's primary targets, was convicted in 1964 on charges of jury tampering and fraud. He was sentenced to 13 years in federal prison. He did not begin serving his sentence immediately. Appeals kept him free for years. He finally entered federal prison in 1967. In 1971, President Richard Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence on the condition that he not engage in union activities until 1980. Hoffa, characteristically, tried to get back into the union immediately. He was engaged in a struggle with his successor at the Teamsters, Frank Fitzsimmons, and with the organized crime figures who had taken control of the union's leadership during his imprisonment. On July 30th, 1975, Hoffa was scheduled to meet with two men at a restaurant called the Machu's Red Fox in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan, outside Detroit. The two men were Anthony Giacalone, a Detroit mob figure, and Anthony Provenzano, a New Jersey Teamsters official and Genevieve's crime family associate. Hoffa arrived at the restaurant. The two men did not. Hoffa made several phone calls, and then he disappeared. He was never seen again. His body has never been found despite numerous tips, excavations, and investigations over 5 decades. He was declared legally dead in 1982. The mob killed Jimmy Hoffa. This is the near-universal conclusion of investigators, journalists, and law enforcement officials who have studied the case. He knew too much. He was trying to reclaim power that others had taken. He was dangerous. His body remains missing. His grave remains undug. He is in death, as he was in life, an absence that speaks louder than a presence. The Kennedy assassination was followed by a pattern that is, depending on your perspective, either a remarkable coincidence or the systematic elimination of potentially dangerous witnesses. The numbers are disputed. The claim that over 100 people connected to the Kennedy assassination died under mysterious circumstances has been analyzed, fact-checked, and qualified extensively by historians and statisticians. The raw number, as typically presented, overstates the case. Many of the deaths in such lists were natural, expected, or only tangentially connected to the assassination, but strip away the statistical padding. And what remains is still troubling. David Ferry, who had connections to both Oswald and Marcello, died in February 1967 as Jim Garrison's investigation was closing in on him. Natural causes were listed, but Ferry had been in good health days before. He had left behind notes that read like farewell letters. The timing was extraordinary. Sam Giancana, murdered in 1975. Days before Senate testimony. Johnny Roselli, murdered in 1976, weeks after Senate testimony. Dorothy Kilgallen, a well-known journalist, who had covered the Ruby trial extensively and who had obtained what she described as a private interview with Ruby, an interview that no other journalist had gotten, died in October 1965 of what was officially ruled an accidental drug and alcohol overdose. Her notes from the Ruby interview were never found. Guy Bannister, the former FBI agent whose 544 Camp Street office shared an address with Oswald's Fair Play for Cuba operation, died of a heart attack in June 1964. He was 60 years old. He had reportedly told associates before his death that he knew things about the assassination that he could not discuss. These individual deaths can each be explained in isolation. Heart attacks happen, overdoses happen, people die of natural causes. The question is not about any single death in isolation. The question is about the pattern, about the fact that so many people who were positioned to know something, or to reveal something, died at inconvenient moments before they could be fully questioned. The pattern either reflects the reality of a conspiracy that was actively maintained through violence, or it reflects the tendency of human beings to find meaningful patterns in random events. Both of these possibilities are frightening in their own way. We have discussed the CIA's role in the Castro assassination plots at length. But there is more to say about the CIA's relationship to the Kennedy assassination. Specifically, about the CIA's behavior after the assassination, and about what that behavior reveals. The CIA's response to the Kennedy assassination was, in institutional terms, characterized by a deep reluctance to disclose what it knew. This reluctance persisted for decades. It persisted through the Warren Commission, during which the CIA failed to disclose the Castro assassination plots. It persisted through the Church Committee. It persisted through the House Select Committee. And it has persisted in the form of continued classified files. Into the present day, why would the CIA be reluctant to share information about an assassination that it did not commit? Several explanations are possible. The most charitable is that disclosing the CIA mob partnership in the Castro plots would have been devastating to the CIA. Institutionally, revelations about what it had done with organized crime would have been a political catastrophe, regardless of whether those activities were connected to the Kennedy assassination. The CIA had reason to stay silent about its activities, regardless of any connection to Dallas. But there is a less charitable explanation, and it must be addressed honestly. The CIA, by November 1963, had significant reasons to want Kennedy gone. The Bay of Pigs had resulted in Kennedy firing the agency's top leadership. Kennedy had begun a process of restructuring the CIA's relationship with the White House that represented a fundamental challenge to the CIA's autonomy. Kennedy had, after the missile crisis, signed a secret agreement not to invade Cuba, effectively guaranteeing Castro's survival and ending the CIA's most urgent covert mission. And Kennedy was, by 1963, exploring back-channel communications with both the Soviet Union and Cuba that represented a fundamental shift in Cold War strategy away from the confrontational approach that the CIA's old guard considered essential. The CIA old guard, the Dulles generation, the men who believed that covert action against communism was the central mission of American intelligence, had every ideological reason to oppose what Kennedy was doing. Some of them may have done more than oppose. James Jesus Angleton, the CIA's legendary counterintelligence chief, was one of the most powerful figures in the agency's history. He ran a paranoid, secretive operation that controlled the flow of information within the CIA for 2 decades. Angleton's relationship to the Kennedy assassination is one of the most enduring mysteries of the entire story. He controlled the CIA's files on Oswald, files that should, given Oswald's Soviet connections and apparent intelligence background, have been extensive. He apparently destroyed many of these files in the early 1970s when it became clear that congressional investigations were coming. Why would the CIA's counterintelligence chief destroy files related to a Soviet defector who had shot the president? Unless those files contain something more compromising than his official biography? The question does not have a confirmed answer. It never has. Howard Hunt, the CIA officer who would later achieve notoriety as one of the Watergate burglars, made statements near the end of his life that suggested CIA involvement in the Kennedy assassination. His claims were specific and implicating. Naming senior figures, his credibility was challenged. His son, St. John Hunt, maintained that his father's deathbed statements were genuine. Hunt died in 2007. His allegations, like so many others in this story, remain in the category of the unconfirmed but unresolved. There is one more connection worth examining carefully. Lyndon Baines Johnson. Johnson became president in the most traumatic of circumstances, sworn in on Air Force, one with Jackie Kennedy standing beside him, still wearing the pink suit with her husband's blood on it. His presidency was in many ways a response to the trauma of Dallas, a furious legislative productivity that produced the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Medicare, and much of the Great Society's architecture. But Johnson was also, in ways that are historically documented, deeply implicated in the Texas political world that intersected with mob interests. His long political career in Texas had involved relationships with figures whose backgrounds were complex. His aide Bobby Baker had mob connections. Johnson's relationship with Carlos Marcello's Texas political allies was part of the texture of Texas Democratic politics in that era. Johnson was also, by multiple accounts, deeply afraid of what a real investigation of the Kennedy assassination might reveal. He pushed for the Warren Commission partly as a way to establish a controlled official investigation that would not go too deep into areas that might prove uncomfortable. In private conversations, some of them recorded, some reported by participants, Johnson expressed doubts about the lone gunman theory. He suggested, in at least one recorded conversation, that there might have been Cuban or mob involvement. He spoke privately of his belief that Kennedy had been the victim of a conspiracy. And yet his Warren Commission was structured in a way that made finding that conspiracy extremely difficult. The contradiction is interesting. A president who privately believed in a conspiracy publicly sponsoring an investigation designed not to find one. What did Johnson know? What did he fear? The historical record gives us glimpses, but not clear answers, to fully understand the mob's fury. You have to understand the unwritten code that governed the relationship between organized crime and American politics in the mid-20th century. The code was simple. If you used the mob, if you took their money, their organizational muscle, their ability to move votes and control precincts, you were incurring an obligation. The obligation was not stated explicitly. It did not need to be. Everyone who dealt with organized crime in the political sphere understood that the relationship was transactional, that favors were expected in return. The Kennedys took what the mob offered. They took it knowingly. In West Virginia and in Chicago and in the various other places where organized crime assisted the 1960 campaign. And then they did something that violated the code so fundamentally that it created an organizational crisis, a crisis of honor and credibility for the men who had delivered for them. They prosecuted the people who had helped them. This was not merely ingratitude. In the world of organized crime, where loyalty and obligation were enforced with violence and death, it was a betrayal so severe that it essentially demanded a response. In the logic of that world, you did not allow someone to disrespect you, to use you and then turn on you without responding with force. To allow it was to invite it from others. To allow it was to show weakness. And weakness in that world was fatal. Robert Kennedy's particular passion for prosecuting the mob, a passion that went beyond professional obligation into something that looked, from the mob's perspective, like a personal vendetta, made the betrayal feel even more pointed. Bobby Kennedy did not just prosecute them. He seemed to enjoy it. He pursued Marcello, Hoover, and Giancana with an energy and intensity that felt like something personal. Because it was personal, Bobby Kennedy genuinely hated organized crime. He considered it a cancer on the American body politic. He wanted to destroy it for Carlos Marcello, who had been seized by federal agents and deposited in a Guatemalan field, literally dumped out of an airplane in a foreign country with no money and no connections. This was not merely a legal setback. It was a humiliation of the most visceral kind. And Marcello responded to humiliation the way he responded to all threats, with calculation and ultimately with violence. The dog's head would be cut off. The tail would stop wagging. But there is another dimension to this story that is often overlooked in the focus on mob grievances. The Kennedy administration was, in ways that are historically documented, genuinely trying to do something remarkable, something that, if it had succeeded, might have changed the trajectory of the Cold War and of American political life in ways we cannot fully calculate. Kennedy was exploring, by 1963, a fundamental de-escalation of the Cold War. His American University speech, delivered in June 1963, was one of the most consequential speeches in American history. A direct appeal to the Soviet Union for coexistence, for mutual recognition of the human costs of the arms race, for a path toward nuclear de-escalation. He was negotiating the first nuclear test ban treaty, which would be signed in August 1963. He was, through back-channel communications facilitated by a French journalist named Jean Daniel and others, exploring the possibility of normalized relations with Cuba. He was growing disillusioned with the Vietnam commitment. His Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, would later say that Kennedy had decided by the fall of 1963 to begin the withdrawal of American advisors from Vietnam. National Security Action Memorandum 263, signed by Kennedy on October 11, 1963, authorized the withdrawal of the first 1,000 American military personnel from Vietnam by the end of 1963. Kennedy, by 1963, was moving away from confrontational Cold War orthodoxy and toward something more complex and potentially more peaceful. This movement alarmed and enraged the hawks in the CIA, the military, and the broader national security establishment. Johnson, after taking office, reversed course on Vietnam and on Cuba, both quickly. The Cuban de-escalation back channel was abandoned, and SAM 263 was replaced by NSAM 273, which reversed the withdrawal commitment. The trajectory that Kennedy appeared to be following, toward de-escalation, toward accommodation, toward a different kind of American foreign policy, was abandoned almost immediately after his death. This is not, by itself, evidence of a conspiracy. Policy differences between Kennedy and Johnson, and between Kennedy and his national security bureaucracy, were real and significant. A new president naturally adjusts policy, but the speed and completeness of the reversal, and the fact that the people most enraged by Kennedy's foreign policy direction were the same people who had operational capabilities for organized political violence, is a historical fact that deserves acknowledgement. 63 years have passed since November 22, 1963. The witnesses are nearly all dead. The primary actors in this story, Marcello, Trafficante, Giancana, Roselli, Lansky, Hoffa, Hoover, Johnson, Ruby, Oswald, are gone. The last people who might have had direct, first-hand knowledge of what happened are gone or very old. And yet the questions remain. Did the mob kill Kennedy? The circumstantial evidence is formidable. 3 bosses with documented threats and documented motives. A geography of connections that links Marcello's world to Oswald and Ruby and Dallas. A pattern of witness deaths that is at minimum remarkable. A cover-up by Hoover that prevented the kind of investigation that might have answered the question. The 1979 House Select Committee's conclusion that Marcello and Trafficante were the most likely suspects in any conspiracy. But circumstantial evidence is not proof. And the specific mechanisms, who gave the orders, who carried them out, how the operation was structured and executed, have never been established with the kind of evidentiary certainty that would satisfy a court. Did the CIA kill Kennedy? The CIA had motive, means, and the operational experience with organized violence that would have made such an operation possible. Its behavior after the assassination, the withholding of information, the destruction of files, the continued classification of documents, is consistent with the behavior of an institution, protecting itself from damaging revelations. But the CIA's behavior is also consistent with an institution protecting itself from revelations about its Castro assassination plots, revelations that would have been devastating regardless of any connection to Dallas. You can explain the CIA as secrecy without assuming it was directly involved in the assassination. Did the mob and the CIA work together? They already had in the Castro plots. The network was in place. The relationships existed. The operational experience had been shared. If there was a conspiracy, the CIA mob partnership that had been built around ZR Rifle would have been its natural infrastructure. Or was it one disturbed young man with a rifle? The Warren Commission said yes. The evidence it relied on was incomplete, compromised by institutional interests, and produced by an investigation that had been designed, consciously or not, to reach a predetermined conclusion. But incompleteness and compromise do not, by themselves, make the conclusion wrong. Oswald had a rifle. Oswald had a history of violent ideation. Oswald had motive. He was a man of deep political passions, who had been failed by every institution he had tried to attach himself to. And the physical evidence, the bullets, the ballistics, the trajectory analysis, while disputed, is not definitively incompatible with a lone gunman in the 6th floor window of the Texas School Book Depository. The truth is probably more complicated than any single answer. Organized crime had motive and connections. The CIA had motive and capability. The Cuban exile community had motive and operational experience. These worlds overlapped. They had worked together before. The idea that one of these actors might have provided the operational infrastructure, while another provided the triggerman, while a third provided the cover, is not inherently implausible. Or Oswald did it alone, and all the connections and the mob threats and the CIA secrets are terrible. Ugly coincidence. The honest answer is that we do not know. Not with certainty, not with the kind of evidentiary confidence that closes questions rather than opening new ones. What we know is the landscape. What we know is the context. What we know is that the world in which Kennedy was killed was full of people who wanted him dead, who had the capacity to arrange his death, and who behaved afterward in ways that were consistent with having something to hide. It is worth, before the closing, spending a moment on what was lost on November 22nd, 1963. Not just the man, not just the presidency. Something larger than that, and harder to articulate. Kennedy was imperfect. He was unfaithful to his wife. He was sometimes reckless. He had made terrible decisions. The Bay of Pigs was a catastrophe. He had allowed the escalation in Vietnam to begin. Even if he was reconsidering it by 1963, he was a politician, with all the compromises and accommodations that entails. But in the summer and fall of 1963, something was happening in his presidency that was genuinely remarkable. The American University speech, the nuclear test ban treaty, the back channel with Cuba, the quiet conversations about Vietnam withdrawal. A man who had spent 3 years learning the brutal realities of nuclear age. Statcraft was beginning to apply those lessons in ways that might have changed the world. We will never know what those changes might have been. The counterfactual is impossible to evaluate. What we can say is this: the energy and the direction that Kennedy embodied in the fall of 1963 toward de-escalation, toward accommodation, toward a recognition that the Cold War could not be won by military force and had to be managed with diplomacy, died with him. The men who replaced his administration and the institutional forces that shaped American foreign policy in the years after his death moved in a different direction. Vietnam claimed 58,000 American lives and millions of Vietnamese lives. The Cold War's military escalation consumed trillions of dollars and decades of geopolitical energy. Whether these things would have been different under a Kennedy second term is unknowable. But the trajectory Kennedy appeared to be following was different from the one that was actually followed. And organized crime, the target of Bobby Kennedy's unprecedented prosecutorial campaign, survived the assassination and continued to thrive. The Get Hoffa squad was disbanded. The FBI's aggressive mob surveillance was eventually pulled back. The momentum of the early 1960s anti-mob campaign was lost. The mob would eventually be confronted by the RICO statutes of the 1970s and 1980s. But that confrontation came later, with different people, under different circumstances. The moment, a particular, unrepeatable moment of the early Kennedy administration, when the full force of the federal government was directed against organized crime, at the same time that organized crime felt most threatened, was gone. The dog's head had been cut off. The tail had stopped wagging. November 22nd, 1963. The shots in Dealey Plaza lasted approximately 6 seconds. 6 seconds that fractured the American story into a before and an after that have never fully reconciled. We have spent this story walking through the shadows, the mob bosses and their threats, the CIA and its secrets, the strange biography of a man who called himself a patsy, the nightclub owner who silenced him, the FBI director who declared the case closed before the investigation began, the commission that confirmed the conclusion it had been given rather than finding one. We have been honest about what is known and what is not, what the documents say and what they don't, what the evidence supports and what it merely suggests. Here is where we land. The mob had motive. Carlos Marcello had been humiliated and deported. Santo Traficante had lost his Cuban empire and his CIA-backed dreams of restoration. Sam Giancana had been surveilled and harassed by the very administration he believed he had helped create. All three had made threats, documented, witnessed, reported threats against the president's life. All three operated in the world of organized violence where such threats were not idle. The CIA had motive. The old guard of American intelligence had been wounded by the Bay of Pigs. Frustrated by Kennedy's Cuba policy, alarmed by his overtures to the Soviet Union, and deeply hostile to the direction his foreign policy was taking, the CIA mob partnership in the Castro assassination plots had created a network of operational connections and mutual leverage that could, in theory, have been used for other purposes. These worlds overlapped. Johnny Roselli was simultaneously the Chicago outfit's representative and the CIA's mob liaison. David Ferry was simultaneously an anti-Castro operative and a Marcello associate. Jack Ruby was simultaneously a Dallas nightclub owner with mob connections and a man who appeared on November 24, 1963, in the basement of the Dallas Police Department. And Lee Harvey Oswald was simultaneously a former Marine with a suspicious Soviet defection, a New Orleans operative who distributed pro-Castro literature from the building that housed a CIA-connected anti-communist's office, a man connected through family to Carlos Marcello's gambling network, and the official lone gunman. The files are still classified. Some of them, perhaps, will be released in coming years. Others may never be released, or may have been destroyed in the decades of institutional self-protection that followed the assassination. The witnesses are dead: Oswald, Ruby, Giancana, Roselli, Traficante, Marcello, Ferry, Bannister, Hoover, Johnson, all of them gone. And the truth, the full, complete, evidentiary truth of what happened in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, may never fully surface. But this much we know: a president was killed. His brother's life's work, the most aggressive federal campaign against organized crime in American history, died with him. The men who had threatened to kill him continued to profit and operate and rule their empires for years afterward. The institutions that should have investigated the killing were compromised by the very networks of corruption and secrecy that the killing was meant to protect. And 60 years later, the official story remains incomplete. Contested and unsatisfying, John Kennedy was 46 years old when he died. He had been president for less than 3 years. He had a wife and 2 young children. He had, in his last months in office, shown signs of a wisdom and a willingness to change that his earlier years had not always demonstrated. He was becoming, perhaps, something extraordinary. We do not know what that would have looked like. We only know what happened instead. The motorcade in Dealey Plaza. The shots. Jackie Kennedy in her pink suit, reaching across the back of that car. The Secret Service agent running up from behind. Too late. Always too late. The rush to Parkland. The flat line. The priest. And somewhere in the shadows, powerful men. Celebrating, not out in the open. Never out in the open. In the careful, guarded, impenetrable silence of men who had done terrible things and gotten away with them. Did the mob kill Kennedy? The evidence says, probably. Did the CIA contribute? The evidence says, possibly. Was it truly one disturbed young man with a rifle? The evidence says, probably not entirely. And the complete answer? The complete answer is still somewhere in the classified files, in the memories of dead men, in the unrecovered documents, and the destroyed evidence and the silence of people who knew and would not speak. The truth may never fully surface, but that does not mean we stop looking. That does not mean we accept the official story, because accepting it is easier than questioning it. That does not mean we let the powerful, men who shaped this story, who used the machinery of government and organized crime and covert operations to protect their interests and silence, their enemies off the hook simply because they are dead and their records are classified, and their secrets were better kept than we might have hoped. History is not just what happened. History is the ongoing attempt to understand what happened, to dig beneath the official versions, to follow the money and the threats and the connections, to ask the questions that power prefers we not ask. November 22nd, 1963. A president is dead, the world mourned, the shadows are still there. And the investigation, the real investigation, the one that has been conducted across 6 decades by historians and journalists and congressional committees and obsessive citizens who cannot let go of the questions, has never truly ended. It will not end with us, but we owe it to the dead, to the president in the motorcade, to the witnesses who were silenced, to the men and women who tried to tell the truth and paid for it, to keep asking, to keep digging, to never stop questioning history. Because somewhere in the distance, between what the Warren Commission told us in 1964 and what the classified files still refuse to show us, the truth is waiting, partial, imperfect, dark. But there, the files are still classified, the witnesses are dead, and the truth may never fully surface. But now you know the landscape, now you know the names, the motives, the connections, the cover-ups, and the questions that 6 decades of official silence have failed to extinguish. Stay curious, stay fearless, and never stop questioning history. And there it is, the mob, the CIA, the cover-up, the silenced witnesses, the classified files. 60 years later, and the full truth is still buried somewhere between the graves of men who knew too much in the locked vaults of agencies that have never been held accountable. If this story made you think, if it made you question everything you were taught about 1963, then hit that like button right now. Share it with someone tonight. Drop a comment below and tell me one thing. Do you believe the mob killed Kennedy? Or do you think the truth is even darker than that? I read every single response, and if you are not subscribed yet, do it right now, because we have more buried stories like this coming every single week. Until next time, stay curious, stay fearless, and never stop questioning what they told you was history.